Tom McCarthy es novelista. Su primera novela, Reminder, ganó el Believer Book Award en 2008 y recientemente fue adaptada al cine. Sus novelas C y Satin Island fueron finalistas del Booker Prize en 2010 y 2015. Es también autor del estudio Tintín y el secreto de la literatura y del libro de ensayos Typewriters, Bombs y Jellyfish. Colabora frecuentemente con The New York Times, The London Review of Books, Harper's y Art Forum. En 2013 recibió el premio inaugural en ficción Wyndham Campbell Prize, otorgado por la Universidad de Yale.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I want to thank all my hosts for inviting me here. It's been an absolute pleasure and continues to be. Special thanks to Graciela and Inez and Patricia and all her team, Danny, Carolina, everyone, and also to the translators who have been making it possible for us to all speak together across languages. So yes, this is called Why We Stay with Poetry, or A Few Mid-Atlantic Arcs. So I'm going to try and string some thoughts together around a series of images which will serve as relay posts or anchors. If the great South American liberator Simón Bolívar famously claimed that serving the revolution is like plowing the sea, then perhaps thinking about the world or about culture or the former's place in the latter and vice versa, and doing this in real time, perhaps thinking faces similar problems, namely trying to lay down fixed points to build constellations in a territory, a situation field that is by its very nature fluid. So let's peg our first thought on an image of exactly this quixotic activity. So this is the HMS Agamemnon laying the first transatlantic cable in 1858. It was the ship's third attempt to do so, made under orders of the British government on behalf of the Atlantic Telegraph Company. The Agamemnon was a warship. She'd participated in the shelling of Sebastopol during the Crimean Campaign. To me, this picture by the Victorian artist Robert Dudley, which we should immediately note is highly constructed, fictionalized, we could say, depicting the vessel from a vantage point outside itself, a patch of sea that couldn't in reality be occupied, at least not with the requisite stability to paint it this way, and sexed up by the dramatic addition of a whale. This image marks a kind of intersection point between romanticism, clouds out of John Constable, sea out of Théodore Géricault, on the one hand, and on the other hand, modernity. The full-rigged 91-gun screw-propelled steamship wiring the deep ocean, seeding it with telecom capacity. It will be another 40 years before Marconi and Paulson go one up and give us wireless and arc transmitters, and another 90 years until Joyce writes in Finnegan's Wake, and I've discussed this with the translators, this is untranslatable, just listen to it in English, until Joyce writes in Finnegan's Wake of lofty Marconi masts from Clifton beaming open tireless secrets to Nova Scotia's listing sister wands, of a contact bridge of 60 radiolumin lines, and of that lion roar in the air again, the zoo-hoo-hoom of feelin' make cool. But the grounds or conditions for this sensibility, this techno-schizoid modernist aesthetic, are being set down right here in 1858. Or are they? Is this the moment of transformation or an echo of it? To put it in Freudian ease, is this the primal scene itself, or more complexly, its reenactment. There is perhaps a clue in the name of the ship. Agamemnon, the seafaring and all-conquering king of Mycenae, comes to us mainly through Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, who dedicates an entire dramatic work, the first installment of his Orestean cycle, to him, to Agamemnon. Agamemnon, the play, opens with an account not so much of Troy's downfall as of the means by which the news, the information of Troy's fall, has found its way to distant Argos. It has traveled through a chain of signal beacons, each one visible only to the last. These beacons, as you can see, far from being simple bonfires, were sophisticated objects, elaborate contraptions with movable parts and attendant encryption systems. Once Argos's night watchman has seen the nearest beacon's light, Queen Clytemnestra comes on stage and delivers a 2-page speech in which she lists, it's really nerdy, she lists each and every one of the chain's transmission points, from Ida's summit to the crag of Lemnos, then to Mount Athos, then across the sea to the lookout towers of Macystus, then Euripus, then Messapion, then over the plain of Asopus, the ridges of Cytherion, the shores of Gorgopus, the peak of Agripanctus, the Saronic Gulf, and finally from the summit of Arachnaeus down to Argos. Right? So each of these points has a signal like this, and she names each of them. She names the network. Here already in 458 BC is an account of spaces lacing by communication technology, a self-conscious one. Just as once the 19th century ship Agamemnon had finished its task, the first message sent between Newfoundland and Ireland simply announced the successful completion of the cable laying. Here too in Aeschylus, what the network communicates first and foremost is the fact and presence of the network. And this network's existence in both cases goes hand in hand with power, with the conquest of space, in Aeschylus's case, with violence and political catastrophe too, not just for the defeated Trojans, but also for Agamemnon himself, who returns home to be immediately killed by Clytemnestra. This murder takes place in water, in the bath she draws for him, part of his homecoming purification ritual. She does this, she kills him, in revenge for his earlier sacrificing on the seashore of their daughter Iphigenia, because he sacrifices her to make the winds blow, to carry the ships to Troy. And after Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon, she begs the gods to let the cycle end there, which of course it doesn't. Her guilt leads her son Orestes to kill her, and his guilt in turn leads the Furies to pursue him to the gates of Athens. Hold on to that connection between water and impurity, spillage and guilt. The next image I've chosen is actually, again, 3 images. The first, an etching by an unknown artist, depicts a very similar scene to the first picture, with the major difference being that instead of cable, it's people who are being slung overboard. In 1781, the captain of the slave ship Zong, having run low on drinking water, jettisoned captive Africans into the Atlantic so as to ensure supplies for his own crew and also to claim insurance on his human cargo. If they perished on board, no such claim could be submitted. The episode inspired, famously, J.M.W. Turner's 1840 painting, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On, later renamed The Slave Ship. While clearly a denunciation of the slave trade, the painting is also generally understood to be an allegorical representation of the fate of European workers during the Industrial Revolution. This year, the African-American artist, Sondra Perry, exhibited in London's Serpentine Gallery her own reworking of this painting, which she had abbreviated to, look at this color spectrum, it's just gone, which she abbreviated to simply Typhoon Coming On. This piece, an immersive installation, I mean, it covered the whole walls. You're in this kind of womb of this. This piece was not simply intellectually or aesthetically inspired by Turner's one. It actively reworked it at a compositional level, subjecting the form and pigment structure of Turner's C to the open source software Blender and the tool Ocean Modifier, allowing the chroma key, they have great names, the chroma key production technique to reprise and extrapolate patches of color and texture, looping them algorithmically. Accompanied by interactive workstations that mix contemporary white-collar working conditions with ergonomic fitness equipment, the piece was thus not simply a historical reflection of the horrors of the Middle Passage. It also addressed the interface of human bodies, technology, and capital within the digital era. For Perry, there's a continuity. This is a very important point she makes. She says in an interview, we don't have to reinvent the wheel when we're talking about labor and relations inside the digital realm, because it's a similar relationship as when we're talking about people being moved over oceans. Perry is a big advocate of open source technology and practice, and she's collaborated with the theorist Fred Moten, whose book, The Undercommons, also thinks about individual and collective agency and authorship around the frameworks of Black history and culture. Equally resonant with her work, as Nora Khan, the writer, has already noted, is the oeuvre of Edouard Glissant, who in a similar vein, the Caribbean writer, who in a similar vein expands and modifies the network theory of Deleuze and Guattari, all that lovely imagery of rhizomes, strata, swarms, and so on, using it to think through the character and legacy of the Caribbean, which, as he writes, has always been a place of encounter and connivance, and at the same time a passageway toward the American continent. For Glissant, the passage over, and indeed often, as is the case of the Zong's passengers, into the abyssal space of the Atlantic, stands as a paradigm for the production of knowledge itself in the face of the unknown. The absolute unknown, he writes in his inimitable style, projected by the abyss and bearing into eternity the womb abyss and the infinite abyss, in the end became knowledge. In his formulation, knowledge can never be understood in terms of rootedness to earth, to territory, identity, or one's own culture, but rather always and only in terms of rootlessness, relay, and capital R, relation. The more attuned a culture, or more precisely intercultural situation is to relation, the more fertile it is as a model for knowledge production, that is, for the production of more relation. Peoples who have been to the abyss, he writes, live relation and clear the way for it. Thus, the terra incognita lying before us is an inexhaustible sphere of variations born of the contact among cultures. Now, this is where poetry comes in. In a telling passage that reworks, it seems clear to me, Mallarmé's vision from Un coup de dés, a throw of the dice, Mallarmé's vision of the shipwrecked sailor casting dice onto the gaping sea in order to generate thought, Glissant claims that if the abyss is a projection of and a perspective into the unknown, then, this is another quote, beyond the abyss's chasm, we gamble on the unknown. We take sides in this game of the world. We hail a renewed Indies. We are for it, and for this relation made of storms and profound moments of peace in which we may honor our boats. He continues, That is why we stay with poetry. We know ourselves as part and as crowd, in an unknown that does not terrify. We cry our cry of poetry. Our boats are open and we sail them for everyone. I really encourage you to read The Poetics of Relation. I don't know if it's in Spanish, but it's a beautiful, beautiful book. It's from about 1990 or so. So for everyone, yeah? Our boats are open and we sail them for everyone. For everyone. Open, or avant la lettre, since he's writing this in 1990, open source, right? Digital culture in an early nascent form does indeed feature directly in the book, The Poetics of Relation, halfway through which Glisson starts to ponder the question of what he rather quaintly calls the computer, a phenomenon that for him, through its very networked or relational nature, even if it's just one box, it's still networked, right? That through its nature could be seen to lend itself in an exemplary way to a fluid aesthetics. The computer, he writes, seems to be the privileged instrument of someone wanting to follow any whole whose variants multiply vertiginously. It is useful, he continues, for suggesting what is stable within the unstable. Therefore, though it does not create poetry, it can show the way to a poetics. Right? It can show the way to a poetics, but it can't produce it. Poetic thought, conversely, he continues in the same Mallarméan manner, poetic thought, this is a quote, poetic thought before or after the accident of the poem or through it attempts to set itself up in an axiomatic system to knit something up whose stitches won't run. That creates the opportunity for an infinite sort of conjunction in which science and poetry are equivalent. Ultimately, though, he concludes, neither system as a system, neither science nor poetry, is complete. Both remain what he calls prospective, right? Accepting accident and understanding that it will be transcended in the never-ending passage towards what, in a supreme and supremely Mallarméan paean to infinite openness, Glisson calls a totality that is unrealizable. I want to finish, though, by thinking more darkly about and more materially, more basely, to use that Bataille form, about writing, which is why I've chosen as my final image or set of images a generic one around which much of my last novel that Graciela just mentioned, much of my last novel, Staten Island, is spun, and that image is the oil spill. So while, like all the other images, it involves an act of overboarding, of débordage, right? So while writing the book, I spent a long time just projecting pictures of oil spills from the internet onto big white walls and transcribing into words literally what I was seeing. And the more I did this, the less clear it became to me what I was actually watching. So footage of the thick, black, unguent liquid from which strands and filigrees arose, first thinning and lengthening before thickening and folding back in on themselves as the black, undulating mass reclaimed them, suggested homemade toffee at the instant of caramelization, or saltwater taffy being worked and reworked, stretched and slapped by a candy store pulling machine. Pictures of dead fish lolling around the seabed, bodies merging with the black mass, then emerging from it again, as though regressing to some previous stage in the evolutionary cycle, suggested some kind of divine scene of creation, of conjoining and dividing as God moved across the waters, replaying godlessly, driven and orchestrated by the whims of matter alone. Images of white birds frolicking on pristine coastlines, unaware of the black tide inching its way towards them, brought to mind classical dramatic notions of fate, or at least modern critical notions of dramatic irony. Then at the level of allegory, what did the oil spill represent? Is it a symbol of man's hubris, an indictment of industrial culture, or again, more classically, a form of chthonic melancholy, that is, of a crippling excess of mela chole, or black bile, the unguent humor to which, as Agamben so lucidly describes in stanzas, medievals attributed this condition, mela chole, melancholy. Or in the way the oil, in rising into crests, breaking in waves, and so on, assumed the form of the water that it had ousted. Right, that's not water, that's oil. In the way it coated rocks and coastlines, thus re-sculpting them as copies of themselves, did it simply play out the very possibility of allegory and symbol and simulacrum of representation to core. The hero, or perhaps anti-hero of this novel, you, a 21st century man without qualities, is a corporate anthropologist. Watching these oil spills, I found that the word corporate also started to disgorge its etymology and constitution. It comes from corpus, body, from which corpse, cadaver, also a corpus of literary work. In a grotesque mise-en-scène of open sourceness, oil spills also raise questions of proprietary agency, of authorship. Does the disaster have an individual author, namely the drunk ship's captain, the oversightful engineer, or the negligent safety officer who might be its immediate trigger? Or does the generative impetus originate with the shipping tycoon, or beyond him even, with that collective man whose body, faceless and compound as oil itself, is the corporation? I don't know, but some kind of work is being enacted here, a marking that transforms a surface. As a writer, what I saw in scenes of black oil flows reaching snowy coastlines, staining them, was another primal scene of writing itself, ink polluting paper, words marring the whiteness of a page. Right? Beckett's stain on silence. The essence of anthropology, too, seemed to ooze out with the oil. For Claude Lévi-Strauss, the order and harmony of the West, the laboratory in which structures of untold complexity are being cooked up, these demand the emission of masses of noxious byproducts. What the anthropologist encounters when he ventures beyond civilization's perimeter fence is no more than its effluvia, its toxic fallout. Levi-Strauss darkly concludes, the first thing we see as we travel round the world is our own filth, thrown into mankind's face. But to follow a Levi-Straussian distinction, we should reject the all too simple auto-presumption that the oil spill involves the invasion of nature by culture. What is oil at its most basic chemical compositional scale? It's rock-filtered organic compounds, ancient trees and dinosaurs and trilobites, epochs of prehistory lodged in Paleozoic ooze, back catalogues of Vendian biota, proto-cnidarians and Ediacara, their amalgamated uralites and coprolites and burrows, their trace fossils, Earth's archive. With the oil spill, the repressed returns. The archive erupts and gushes to the surface, as it does in the case of those oil derivatives. Plastics, clothes, toys, packaging, the husks of old computers, all the material substrata of the information era that now swirl around every ocean on the planet. These are the same archives overwritten for and by the Anthropocene, like a palimpsest or cheap plastic toy that provides Freud's greatest metaphor for memory, a mystic writing pad. You know, you write on it, but the thing is underneath. Whichever metaphor you choose, it's something legible, material information clutter. Data is junk, and junk is data. So finally, is this clutter, the question, is this clutter, this saturation, to be celebrated? Of course not, but just as a devil's advocate question, let's imagine, is this clutter, this saturation, to be celebrated or recoiled from? Perhaps ultimately neither. Better perhaps to overwrite Glisson's words with Donna Haraway's recent formulation and say that it's a trouble with which we should stay. The sea is dirty for a reason. It's full of Iphigenias, and we owe them an audience. We owe it to them to tune into their transmissions. The task is not to cleanse or purify ourselves, but rather to dive into the archive restlessly, or as Derrida would have it, feverously. Derrida, too, plays the etymology game, unpacking in his 1990 work, Archive Fever, Mal d'Archive, the very word archive. To find, it means a boat, an ark of acacia wood, also the Ark of the Covenant, also a coffin, also a cupboard or black box. For Derrida, the archive, no matter from what epoch it originates or in which epoch it is opened up, is always technological media, what he calls hypomnesic and prosthetic experience of the technical substrate. From the word source term archaion, the Greek word archaion, come house, domicile, address, also the residence of the Greek superior magistrates or archons. The ark contains the law, but it's the archon's task to administer it through ongoing attentiveness, interpretation, and debate. This is why, for Derrida, the archive is oriented both towards the past and, just as importantly, the future, raising what he calls the question of the future itself, the question of a response, of a promise, and of a responsibility for tomorrow. And in doing this, it raises the possibility of nothing less than democracy. Never mind poetry and the computer, the question is whether poetry and democracy have the same source conditions, move in the same flows and currents. If they do, then ploughing the sea might not be such a crazy undertaking after all. Thank you very much for your attentiveness.
Preguntas para Graciela y Tom, por favor.
We have similar images, huh? Similar images.
¿Alguno tiene alguna pregunta? ¿No?
No, just a quick question. I was distracted at the end. Could you explain the connection between poetry and democracy once more? Just the last point.
Well, the archive for Derrida entails the ground condition for democracy, right? No democracy without archive, because that's the black box from which will come interpretation, debate. So democracy is not a set of conditions. It's a process of an inexhaustible process of interpretation, right? It's always to come, like Mallarmé's book. It's to come, avenir, and this is kind of remarkably similar to what Glisson says about poetry, right? It makes the way for poetry. I mean, the abyss, this inscribed space, it's like Heidegger's Abgrund, you know, it's marked with all the deaths of all the gods. This is the condition for poetry. So the poet for Heidegger tends to the archive, and I think Glissant's kind of riffing off that idea. But I'm amazed by the closeness of these thinkings, of these lines of thought, that poetry and democracy might have the same conditions. It's a proposition. I'm not able to argue this concretely, but it's just a what if. Yeah.
And poetry one associates with the poet.
Well, no. I mean, again, Heidegger, the poet is not the one who says something. The poet is the one who listens before speaking. So poetry is already reception. Think of Jean Cocteau's film Orphée. You know, the poet is the one who tunes into the transmissions from somewhere else. And even when he goes to that somewhere else to find out the source, he finds out it's a massive collage. It's a remix of 100 different sources, from stock market prices to plagiarized lines of other poets. So there is no one originator. The task of the poet would not be to, as an individual author, to have something to say. It would be to tune in, to draw into kind of receptive audibility, a network of echoes and other voices.
May I say a question? Over here, Tom. So I might say it in English because I don't feel comfortable when asking Spanish. Sorry, again. It's not really a question, it's a kind of double comment, or maybe one question for each. First of all, thank you for the beautiful panel. Very inspiring. So, taking the line of Claire Bishop, she was saying that kind of research-based art and the way that she traced back to the digital, the experience of the internet, that this extend the mode of attention of the internet to the gallery somehow, that is still immersed in this type of fatigue of information, to take a term that we used before. And Graciela was saying that art, in fact, can be a sort of pedagogic device for us to put back the kind of politics of attention that we would, let's say, be taught to deal with this stream of information, right? That art could be something that would really rework our systems of engaging with image and attention. So I'd like you to speak a bit more about that, you know, how you see the role of art in kind of being a counter or a form of resistance of a type of capitalism that is really capturing our attention. And I think that was really interesting, the way that Claire Bishop was showing that algorithm that can see the way that you read the page in a kind of F pattern, and art being as a way of teaching us a resistance to that mode of attention. And to Tom, I would say if the archive is the sea, and the sea, of course, this kind of, now the sea is this kind of muddy sea, right? It's not the blue sea anymore. It's a kind of a tainted sea, right? So what kind of democracy would be that if that's the archive?
Bueno, en principio,